And here we go. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Maddox, and I'm the lead pastor at North Fresno Church. And today we are having a conversation with some friends about how to faithfully engage grief and loss and disappointment during a holiday season unlike any other that we have experienced, but hopefully we'll pick up some helpful strategies and faithful perspectives to not only help us through this season and the challenges that this season presents to the experience of Christmas and the holidays and all that means for us, as well as well into the future. Hopefully this conversation continues to bear fruit. So I'm going to invite each of our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves briefly, share a little bit about themselves, and then we'll get going with our conversation. So we'll start with Lois. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Lois?
Hi, I'm Lois Ewert, and I am a nurse practitioner. I've worked for Fresno County Schools for many years. I run a mobile clinic. I used to work with a school-based mobile clinic, and I used to work with the Migrant Education, Migrant Health Division of Fresno County Schools. I've also lived and worked in Central America, in Honduras, for about 3 years out in the middle of nowhere, which was super fun, challenging.
Amazing.
Also. And I have 2 children who are both adults. Josh and Gracie are married and living in Colorado, and Hannah's in Pasadena at Fuller Seminary pursuing her doctorate in psych.
Excellent. Thank you, Lois. Now we'll jump over to Tim. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Dustin. Tim Neufeld here. And well, I've had a little bit of a history with North Fresno, I guess. I was youth pastor there for 7 years. That was kind of in a stint of 15 years of pastoring. And then it was 20 years over at Fresno Pacific teaching in ministry and theology. And most recently, I'm a associate marriage and family therapist working on licensure and have a private practice with Zimmerman Therapy Group. So I'm coming at this topic from a number of different angles today. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Tim. And then Louisa.
Hi, I am Louisa Gee. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. Originally I am from Scotland. Should have said that first. From Scotland, I'm a seminary grad. Professionally I have experience working in community mental health, and then just have finished up 2.5 years working with Kaiser Permanente, and I'm moving on to work with Sierra Meadows, which is an intensive outpatient program. My experience with grief is my own therapy, and just my therapy practice has been shaped by grief. When I was in seminary, my mother-in-law passed away, and 2 months before our first child, we have Callum, who's 9, and Finn, who's 3. And then in 2016, I lost a pregnancy, and that drove me to seek out group therapy for grief. So that's, kind of my experience.
Well, thank you, Louisa, for that introduction and for setting the table for us and sharing vulnerably and openly to get us started. I appreciate that. So we are going to have a conversation together. I've asked each of them to, we'll go through some questions that I'll ask each one of you panelists, and then we'll just kind of interact together. Throughout the time, for those of you who are tuning in, there is a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen if you are viewing this on a computer, or somewhere else on your screen if you're watching on a tablet or on a phone. But you can put that in. Any questions that come up that you'd like to hear them address, you can put a question in that Q&A box, and at the end we'll have a little bit of time for interaction and Q&A in that way. And you can also put it in the chat box. I'll be kind of monitoring both of those as we go along. But let's go on ahead and dive in. So Louisa, as a mental health professional, how would you define and describe grief and loss? And what are the similarities or differences or connection points between them? And yeah, and then the follow-up to that is, how does it show up, and what are some of the typical strategies that people utilize to cope with grief and loss?
Yeah. So loss is anything that we no longer have that has value to us. So that could be a relationship, a person, a job, a place, a space, an event, right? We can lose all these types of things and many, many more things. And then grief is the natural response we have to that loss. So grief, you asked about how does it show up? Grief is multifaceted, right? It shows up physiologically, so in our bodies, right? Aches and pains and headaches, and then psychologically, so in our mental health, and spiritually, the way that we interact with God, with one another in our spiritual community, cognitively, so changes the way that we think about things, and then behaviorally changes the way that we do things. Yeah, and so grief is messy, right? It can be a lot of different emotions and a lot of different symptoms all at once. It doesn't follow a linear trajectory. It's all over the place. Initially, often it starts with shock, right? Our initial response is we're shocked, and moves us to a place where we can't express and we're without words. But then it might look like disbelief, depressed, sadness, anger, anxiety, fear, difficulty focusing, memory issues. So it looks like many different things. And then the follow-up question was about how do we cope with it? What are the strategies? And I have worked with many, many people in grief, and this is an extremely unpopular response to the question of how can I make the pain go away? It's you gotta feel the pain. You have to go through it. The only way through grief is through it, right? You have to
can't go around it, can't go under it. Gotta go through it.
You gotta go through it. Yeah. So we have to allow ourselves to feel those feelings. And as a society, we are pain adverse, and we are negative feeling adverse, right? We want to be comfortable, and grief is all about the pain and having to feel the feelings. And our feelings are important, right? Our feelings communicate to us. They tell us, hey, this person, this job, this place, this space, this event, whatever the loss is, that was important to you. So it communicates to us, communicates to other people, lets them know, hey, this was really important to us too. And it motivates us, changes what we're going to do, how we interact. So then how do we start feeling our feelings? We have to acknowledge them. We have to name them and say, oh, this is grief, right? The fact that I can attend church, physically in person, that is a loss, and I'm experiencing grief, right? My loved one passed away. This is grief, right? So naming it and giving yourself permission to feel those feelings. So asking yourself, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What's my body saying, right? What are those aches and pains in my body telling me? What was going on right before I had this grief burst? So we have an urge to push away the painful emotions. And yeah, maybe it works just in the brief moment, but our feelings need to be acknowledged by ourselves, by other people. So I like this analogy of, or image or metaphor, I never remember it. Whoever is an English professor or English scholar can let me know which it is. So imagine having a beach ball and you're in the pool. If you push that beach ball down, right? Yeah, you can do that for a while, but eventually that beach ball is going to pop up, and you know it's going to pop up in your face, right? And grief does that. We can push it away, but it is going to end up right smack in your face, and it gains energy, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, again, unpopular opinion and counterintuitive, is we have to just let the beach ball exist, right? It's got to exist on top of the water, and it's got to hang out there, and we acknowledge, yeah, I have this loss, I have this grief in my life, right?
Right.
So acknowledging those emotions as they come up for myself. And then the other part of it is our grief needs to be witnessed. Other people need to hear or witness and sit with us in our grief. Don't need solutions or advice or opinions or how to fix it, because we can't fix grief or we can't fix a loss. What we need is just to be witnessed, to be acknowledged, to be validated, to be supported. Yeah. So, and in this time, like in these times, that looks different, right? Like it might be a virtual support group, individual therapy, virtually connecting with our small group.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. That was a rich answer with lots in it. So good. Yeah. And I think, just to underscore something that I think gets missed a lot, is there isn't just one way to experience grief, and nor is there this set pattern or progression that, okay, I should be here now, but I'm not. It happens, it unfolds, and we have to go with it and acknowledge it. And I love the idea that our grief needs a witness. It can't just be us. So thank you for that. Lots of good follow-up question material in there. Tim, so you now are in the mental health world, but you have been around it in the world of ministry and in higher education. So what are some of the ways in these different sort of arenas of your life as your calling has unfolded? What's your experience with grief in these different settings? How have you seen different generations of people, from youth to elders? How have you seen some of the differences in how generations experience grief? Yeah, jump in there.
Yeah. Thanks. I like this question actually a lot. It's kind of a developmental question, like how do we experience grief in the different stages of life? And I think there's some differences and there's some commonalities. And so I've, seen while I was working at a pastoral level with maybe youth and children, a kind of grief. I remember standing on the curb of a teen whose father had just died of a heart attack. And I didn't even go inside, but I love what you're saying, Louisa, just the ministry of presence, just being on the curb outside the house. And I could tell that he had looked through the window and he had seen me there. Or, of a child who loses a pet, that's a significant of a loss as a spouse in later life. A senior who loses a spouse in late life that they've been together with for decades. So all of these, a college student who loses a relationship, maybe she thought she was going to marry, that's a kind of loss that just takes months and months to work through. Again, Louisa, I love what you're saying about this idea that you have to go through it, right? I like what Carl Jung said about life kind of being in a first half and a second half. This is really simplistic, but we do really do different kinds of tasks, I think, in the first half of life than in the second half of life. And in that first half, those losses, I think they end up showing up in things like, you know, maybe a real simple, just pets and friends at school, or later in relationships, or somebody could lose a job. That could be a significant loss for them, especially right now in COVID. We might lose some kind of a spiritual framework and understanding that we had just grown up with, that is deconstructed and no longer there. That can be a huge loss. Dealing with the death of your own parents, where roles are kind of reversed, and now you become the parent of your parents in late stages of life. That can happen in the first half. Second half, I think more about losing, you know, a partner, losing a spouse, or even having to lose your own children through some occurrence, or loved ones. You know, we get older, and the older we live, the more we see the death around us, so we become aware of that death and our own mortality. Seniors can be, they can experience the loss of their career after working just for decades in a specific field. Loss of health as the body can deteriorate, or loss of independence. Such a hard conversation any of us will ever have. And, you know, talking to parents about losing driving, you know, privileges, that can be a really difficult loss as well. So all of those, I think, are really significant losses, and kind of can't be graded as more than another, because it's really individual, right? Loss really hits everybody differently. Everybody mourns differently, different frequency of that mourning, different intensity of that mourning. But I do think one thing that would be in common, as Louisa already pointed out, is that we all long for somebody to walk in that grief with us, and in that loss with us, in that disappointment with us. And it's just really important, even if you have one empathetic soul, you know, one empathic figure. So again, I think in terms of theology, I think of it as a ministry of presence. Just, it's really a theological, spiritual moment to be present. In clinical terms, I would see it as an intervention to witness this with a person as they go through it, to mirror it, to feel it empathically with them. That's more my style. Some have different approaches, but all of us long for a kind of meaning to be generated out of this. And probably the worst thing we can do is we can hear some of these myths of grief, you know, false theories, kind of like God sends the hurt, but he loves us so much, you know, these kind of mixed messages, theological message. God sends pain. Some people interpret that as punishment. God sends pain to punish me. We hear that kind of a myth often. Or God sends suffering to test us, which is all kind of rubbish. I really believe God hurts with us, and God is the ultimate witness to our pain. So that's just one thing I would, you know, you look at the Psalms, they're just full of pain. They're full of heartache, crushing heartache. God, how could you abandon me? And so I'll often tell people, just, you know, give a good cuss at God. He can handle it. You know, he really can. I think cussing is a form of affinity and endearment anyway. If you're going to cuss at me, I think you probably know me well enough to feel comfortable with me. I mean, we need to let some of that out righteously and honestly. And God is not so holy he can't take it. In fact, that's, I think, what he wants to do is be with you in that. So maybe that's enough said for now. Just thinking a little bit developmentally there.
Yeah, that's rich. There's that reminds me, Tim, you'll probably have fond memories of this, but there's an interview between Eugene Peterson and Bono, where Bono, the question was asked of Bono, like, what would you want to say to Christian musicians and artists and poets? And the one thing he says is, like, you don't be so happy all the time. Like, let the pain and the sorrow out. And that's what I thought of there. But yeah, so great stuff. Thanks, Tim. Lois, over to you. So as a person working in nursing and public health, how do you see, and Louisa has mentioned this too, like one of the ways that grief shows up is in our bodies, through aches and pains, through other physical health, biological issues. How have you seen this showing up, especially in some of the contexts in which you've worked, where probably grief and loss is the experience of that is present in exceptional ways for many people. How have you seen that show up in your experience?
Well, I just want to say, Louisa, it's so good to hear you talk again. I was in a grief group with you, and I always appreciated your thoughts and your words and the way you express them. And Tim, your knowledge and experience is always welcome. And I have always appreciated everything. And I just wanted to approach this from two places. Personally, for people who might not know, I lost my husband 2 years ago. And for me, grief is more than just loss, it's change. And it's the change, I think, that's so hard when we think about grief or loss. And change comes differently to everybody. Some people handle it one way, some people handle it another way. But when that change is permanent, and I think in our current circumstance, I think we are experiencing more permanence in some of the changes that we are currently going through. It might not be a loss of someone, but it certainly might be a loss of a job or a career or financial, or a loss of relationship with whoever. And it's such huge change. And so for me, it's the change that's so difficult. And what I see in my colleagues, in my clients, is the struggle with everything being different. And that comes out in a lot of different ways. Some people get very irritable. I've seen it with mostly my clients, not my colleagues. Clients get very irritable when things don't go exactly the way they wanted or the way that they were expecting. And it's because of everything else that's going on in their life. I see a lot of weight gain. Everybody there goes complaining of weight gain. And I don't think I've really talked to anybody who said they've lost weight. Clients, students, my colleagues, teachers, nurses, everybody is saying, I've put on some pounds. Some more than others, but that is all part of that piece. And I think that's a health challenge. It's not just, we're not just experiencing mental health issues, we're beginning to experience physical health issues too. And the mental health, of course, is from being isolated and not having our routines with people, and not just people, but close family members, our routines and our traditions and our holidays and our birthdays, our celebrations. I myself missed going to 5 weddings this year, 3 family members that were really important to me, and 2 children of very good friends of mine. And we couldn't attend. So those losses begin to add up, especially as time goes on. And I see this over and over and over in my colleagues and also in my patients. I don't get to see my patients the way I used to. That has been a huge loss for me because I miss seeing my kids, my students. I miss being able to interact with their families and with their teachers, and in the education field, you make a lot of friends and a lot of connections in different schools. Trying to think what else I see in people. I really see those 2 things more than anything, is the changes, the lack of exercise and the way we go about our normal life. I don't know if that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lois. Yeah, I just heard someone refer to the COVID-19, like the
Yeah.
freshman 15, like putting in terms of weight gain in response to how we've,
We
yeah,
hope
so
it's not
that's
that much.
right. So thank you. Okay, so Louisa, we'll jump back over to you. And you've highlighted a little bit of this already, but if you could draw out a little bit more of some of the things, the particular ways that you have seen COVID impacting grief and loss. Lois just shared about missing, weddings and the traditions of the holidays. And I've just noticed pastorally, as I've had conversations with people, the things that are difficult in ordinary time and under ordinary circumstances are just exponentially more challenging. Everything from just parenting to family conversations. We had an election this year. All sorts of stuff are just underscored by more difficulty with COVID. So how have you seen, what are the particular ways that you've seen grief and loss and change show up due to COVID? And what in that what are some of the pros and cons of some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we as a community, as a society, we've lost our sense of security, right? And our sense of safety. Even small, tiny things like going to the grocery store have become issues that now we're addressing in therapy, right? Like we have to talk about how do we go to the grocery store? How do I deal with my anxiety, right? We have so much loss of our places that we used to gather, right? Like Lois mentioned about isolation. Isolation is huge. Grief, whatever grief or loss you've experienced, grief is isolating, right? I feel like I'm the only person who has this particular grief or who feels this as intensely, and everybody else around me doesn't seem to quite get it, right? And then I am actually physically isolated from my community. So yeah, like COVID is affecting us in that way. Then also there's this like layer upon layer of loss, right? How is it affecting me personally, right? Like I can't participate in communities the way I used to, but then every night or every day that I'm reading the newspaper or I'm watching TV, we cannot comprehend how this is affecting our nation, even just our community. I was looking at the numbers today and I don't have a context to put that in, right? I cannot understand that concept is going on as well. So we're also vulnerable to our emotions with this loss, this collective loss, let alone if we've actually lost someone during this time, or maybe we were grieving right before this as well. So I think the cons are really easy, like to understand. Where like I can see all the negative consequences of this, right? It's isolating. Our usual ways of grieving are taken from us, right? We've never been in a place where we've had virtual funerals, right? Like we've never, no matter what sort of disaster has happened, we've always been able to have funerals, and there's importance in ritual, right? There's a reason we gather. There's a reason it helps us comprehend what has happened, right? We feel so disconnected with this virtual communication. So we've never had these physical distances, not being able to participate in rituals, or even just the way that we normally comfort one another. When something happens, when someone loses a job or loses a relationship or loses a loved one, we go over to their house and I bring a casserole or I bring a pint of ice cream, right? I can't do that anymore. So we've lost all these ways that we normally cope with loss.
Yeah.
And then we're grieving on multiple levels. The pros, right, the things that I see are there's more creativity, right? We have to be more creative, right? Okay, I'm going to bring the casserole and I'm going to leave it at your doorstep, and then I'm going to go back 12 feet and I'm going to yell my love across the driveway, I have to be more intentional, right? I can't assume that I'm going to bump into you anymore. I have to intentionally seek you out to provide that support. I also think like it's helping us because we don't normally talk about grief, right? I think as North Fresno Church, we do a great job of talking about grief and lament, but as a society, we don't talk about grief, right? And I think this is an opportunity to normalize it, to talk about it at our kitchen table, right? Talk about it with our families, even with our little kiddos, right? Talking about, yeah, it really sucks that you don't get to play with little Billy Bob anymore, right? Talking about that grief. So just having that conversation. And then, so this is shamelessly stolen from another therapist. I will admit that. They were saying that another pro is bringing the grief or the work of your grief out of the therapy office and into your home. So I hear this a lot is people say, well, I come to you, Louisa, for an hour a week, and that's where I do my grieving. And then I go home and I pretend like it doesn't exist, right? Because I want that safe place where it all happens in there. But actually, with this new like virtual therapy, virtual grief support, we're bringing that into our home and it's becoming part of like my normal life, right? And then the other piece is the virtual support groups. So I will say I was a naysayer at the beginning. I was like, this is not going to work. There's some sort of magic in the meeting, right, in person. But actually, so I'm running a grief support group at work virtually, and I hear the same responses. People are saying, I love this group. I feel supported. You hear me, right? They're getting the same benefits virtually from a support group as they would in person. So there are pros of what's going on.
Absolutely.
Pushing us
right. Yeah. So that's a great point on. I've got some friends who, because of COVID, like need it, or they're experiencing something that's a really kind of small sliver, a rare experience, and but because of COVID, there's one grief support group in the country around this issue, and it's in Boston. But because of COVID, they've opened it up to people, and through telehealth and that sort of thing, they're able to engage in it. And and what a gift it is to be able to have those opportunities where like, oh yeah, why wouldn't this work? To be kind of forced into that place. But with the challenges not excluded. So Lisa, you've kind of highlighted the reality that our culture just doesn't quite know what to do with grief or with loss, or even with funerals. We think that, okay, like that's the place where it happens, like in the therapist's office, but then once we close the door on it, we move on. So Tim, what are some of the cultural narratives that shape this approach to grief, or other approaches to us wanting to resist engage in grief and loss and disappointment?
Yeah, and the four of us probably belong to more of an individualistic Western tradition where this is very hard work, right? So if we think of European Western, particularly I'm Northern European Germanic, we're very conservative when it comes to emotions, to relationships. Mennonites, I've often said Mennonites, we do great with our genealogy and tracking our lineage, but we do terrible at making relational kind of meaning out of it, like a genogram kind of experience. We're great at genealogies. We're terrible at genograms. So that's very different than...
Can you that's really important. Can you just, what is a genogram for those who don't know?
Well, a genogram looks like a family tree, but it can be built around all kinds of different relationships and issues and experiences in life. For instance, we usually do something with like, how did these people get along with each other? So how did your mom and her sister get along as opposed to the other sister in the family? So we just start seeing some relational, some connections or disconnections there. Well, I think our lack of ability to do that plays right into this conversation about grief, loss, disappointment, because we tend to push away emotion, right? We're very good at the lineage. We're very good at the technical things. We sing 4-part harmony. It's just great. But we don't improvise very well. We don't do jazz very well a lot of times, but man, we can rock the 4-part harmony. So other cultures, I think, have an advantage over us in a lot of ways. If we think about Eastern cultures, Asian cultures, for instance, maybe some African cultures really celebrate ancestors and acknowledge loss in a way that we don't know how. So, we don't spend much time in graveyards, most of us. We don't go back and visit those that we've lost. We don't have these kind of moments, which are especially important in the holidays at Christmas, to remember that pain and that suffering that we've been through. Other cultures, sometimes I think, have a little better way of doing that. Middle Eastern cultures are very loud, right? We have just story after story in scripture, which is a Middle Eastern context of wailing and grieving. I think of Hmong culture. I have a friend who's a therapist, and he's from the Hmong culture and a leader in his clan, actually. And his responsibility of mourning loss, of staying up all night for day after day after day as the family sits in the home and grieves together. I mean, we just don't have, a lot of us, those kinds of experiences. A Native American pastor friend of mine, Christian, I asked him about death and his view of it. He says, yeah, it's very different than you people. We just see it as another step of life. It's just crossing a river into another experience of living, of life, of relationship with God. Very much not fearing that loss, but willing to be in it and live in it. One of my favorite authors here, I think, is Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, survived a concentration camp. But, one of the ways he would do that is hang on to the memory of his wife, who he never saw again. But he had to find meaning in that memory of his wife. And that's what pushed him through his difficulty and his suffering. And so he comes out with a whole logotherapy. I mean, he says we typically find meaning in 3 things. We find it in our work, we find it in our love of others and in relationships, and we find it in suffering, actually. So if you think about what COVID's doing to us, right, Louisa? I mean, we've lost a lot of work. We've lost a lot of relational contact. What are we left with? We're left with suffering. And I think that people are looking for any way to find meaning in all of this madness that's going on. In fact, we could talk about, why do so many conspiracy theories abound? That's exactly what it is. It's the grasping at trying to find some kind of control and meaning in the midst of the chaos. I'm just thinking here, I'll say this, I think most people understand it, but in America, we pray, God, remove the suffering, right? But I think in so many other cultures, what's their prayer? God, take me through the suffering, especially in maybe persecuted countries, or where there's more poverty, or less individualism, or less reliance on materialism and consumerism. So, yeah, I think our cultural experience is very different than some of the others. We really risk a lot by staying within ourselves, our individual, it kind of, pull your bootstraps up mentality. I'm strong enough, I can get through this. We risk a lot. We risk the soul, because we say we don't want to dwell in the past. We don't want to think about the negative, but it's that beach ball, right? It's a great image. It's that beach ball that just gets stuffed down. what COVID is doing is it's bringing out all the anxiety and depression of so many losses in life. Like you said, Dustin, I think it's perfect. It's compounding them. It's making them complex loss, what was once just more standard kind of a loss. And this is a really scary space. And one of my encouragements is to everybody, make sure you have somebody and be somebody who can be empathetic to another in some of this grief and this loss that we're facing right now. It's very important not to try to do it alone and on your own strength.
Yeah, that's so much good stuff in there, Tim. And it brought to mind just this kind of, it feels almost scandalous in our culture to say that one of the primary places that we find meaning is in suffering, not on the other side of suffering, of how, hey, great, look how great and virtuous we are because we made it through to the other side. But in the midst of it, how profound of an idea that is. And one of my favorite books over the last couple of years is this book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And it was this understanding of how the early church saw itself as a culture of fermentation, of like of wine or beer being brewed in this kind of process of chemical breakdown and all of that stuff, and using those experiences to become the types of people through certain practices and ways of being together as a community that developed patience in the midst of suffering, because it's only when we are able to slow down in the suffering rather than try and speed our way through it that we're able to notice that God is right there with us as we take each step through it. So really good stuff.
Yeah, I think maybe just one thing to add very quickly is that we have to stop interpreting this as weakness. It's the strong of us that will reach out and share and empathize and be engaged in this with each other. It's not a weakness to want those things and to reach out. It's very human, actually, to experience that.
Right. Yeah, and there's this weird line in Acts chapter 5 where the apostles are hanging out in the temple court, and they are imprisoned and beaten. And it said they rejoiced because they were considered worthy of receiving the suffering of Jesus. And that's a whole different conversation for a whole different day. But on that same point, yeah, that's great, Tim. Okay, Lois, we've been talking around some of this, but if you could share a little bit from your own experience or from whatever comes to mind on how does grief and loss shift and change our experience of the holidays, of the traditions that we come to find meaning in, the change you mentioned in some of those routines and patterns that we come to find comfort and familiarity in. So what's your experience here?
Well, I'm going to comment first on what Tim said about the different cultures. If you don't mind, I'm going to not ignore your question, but I do want to say something because Tim, you triggered my thoughts. When I lived in Central America, I lived in an area of Honduras called La Mosquitia, and it was very, very isolated. There was no roads. The only way you could get in was either by boat via the sea, the ocean, or you'd have to fly in. That was the only way you could get in. So we were very isolated and limited to a generator powered electricity for a couple hours in the evening. And it was village life with a small clinic. We had a lot of people pass away, and the village wasn't very far away from the clinic. And we had a lot of North Americans come to help us because we were limited staff and we relied a lot on volunteers. And I had been there probably a year or so. And at breakfast one day, one of the volunteers was complaining and saying, "Oh my gosh, did you hear that last night?" And I was going like, "What happened last night? I don't know." The wailing that was carrying on and on and on and on. And I realized the way the mosquito people dealt with death was to be communal. And they all came around and they would join the family in their home and or around their home and sing and cry and talk. And this went on for quite a number of days. And I guess I had gotten so used to it, I didn't hear it after a while. It was just part of what they did. And it was very healing for the family because the family didn't have to do anything. And granted, it was not an industrial, by any means, an industrial area of the world. So, they needed help cooking and cleaning and getting their laundry done and all those things that life needed to happen to keep life going. But it made me think of what you said, and it also made me realize that in our valley we have so many different cultures represented, not just Hispanic, Caucasian, and Asian, but so many different cultures. So when we approach people and we talk about change and grief and disappointment and loss, we have to try and understand their context. And it's really hard to do that. So when I talk about my own, I can only talk about my own experience. It is what I experienced, even differently from what my children experienced as they said goodbye to their dad. And so when we talk about traditions and holidays and those kinds of things, ours didn't happen after Steve died. Ours happened as he went through his illness. And every year it was just a little bit different. And so we learned to figure out what was important. Was it important that we had turkey and ham at the holidays, or was it important that we were together? Was it important that we had our Christmas stockings up? Did it really matter that the Christmas tree went up this year? We kind of had to figure those things out. And I think that is what we as a family and I as an individual had to decide what really is important here. So I mean, that's I think all that I can really say about traditions and holidays.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I love it. Yeah, it's a opportunity. It can create, if we're open to it, opportunities to sort through what matters most. To ask the question: Are we majoring in the minors here, or is there a deeper level that we're being invited to engage in? Because what are the holidays? But these opportunities to focus on the things and the people that matter the most to us.
And I forgot to say one of the other things that was important for me, and I think important for people to know and understand and to try and do also, is to communicate, not with everybody, but certainly to try and communicate with those who are important to you, what is happening in this time and space that you're experiencing this. Perhaps you don't want to participate in the holidays the way you normally would. And instead of just walking and backing away from it, talk to people about it. Make sure that those important people in your life that have been there to support you are still there, and that you're there for people too. because other people are going through the losses also. It isn't just us that are,
Right.
it isn't just me that's going through this loss. It's other people. So to try and keep those lines of communication open and is pretty important.
Yeah, I'm reminded in that, Lois, of just how many people I've heard from who have experienced some type of loss, some trauma or some pretty acute form of grief, who after some distance and perspective began to see it as this sort of catalyzing moment for them to say, I need to be with other people who are going through this sort of thing. That this is something that God is using in my life to help with that ministry of presence, or to help bear witness and say that I know that you might feel alone and isolated right now, and I'm here to be with you. I know what that feels like, and how important that is. And I think another thing that you mentioned that's particularly important for the church as it tries to bear witness and to accompany those of us who are in the throes of grief, that one way that we offer help at one point in time is just that. It's a point in time, and a point in time in somebody's grief, and that might change at another point in time, and the thing that was helpful at one point isn't helpful anymore at a later point. And to just give permission to yourself and other people to continue to ask. I know that that's one of the hesitations that we have. It's like, oh, I don't want to bring it up, but it's actually a really loving and caring thing to say, what do you need today? What do you need now? And is that different than you told me this a couple months ago? But now, is there something else that you need, something different? And maybe that might bring up something in you, because you might not be the person who's best equipped to help in that situation. But that's something important to know, to surrender that, to say, I ran my leg of this race with this person, and now we can tap into somebody else. So rich thoughts there. Thanks, Lois. So this one's for all of us, and this is kind of the last one for our group before we go to Q&A. And I'm just gonna look here and see. I don't see any questions in our Q&A. So now's the chance for those of you who are listening in to jump in and ask some questions, or you'll just be stuck with me asking a couple more questions. But for all of us, our cultures shape the way that we make meaning out of grief or experience it. But another really important resource that's been an undercurrent of how we engage grief and loss and disappointment is as followers of Jesus. That places us within a particular story, and gives us as characters within that story a different way of understanding what is happening in this life that we're living. So how does that play in for each of you as followers of Jesus who work in the world? Just personally, how has that helped you? But how has it also helped you as people who work for the common good, work for the benefit of our neighborhoods and cities? How does being a follower of Jesus help you help other people in this work? So Tim, why don't we start with you?
You bet. Number of ways to go at this. I think, let me just think of the theme of the suffering servant. Jesus as suffering servant. I mean, Jesus knew Isaiah the prophet, who had laid out this wounded healer that would come to save the world. And so Henry Nouwen's title, which he borrows from Jung as well, there's this notion of wounded healer. The one who cannot heal unless he has been wounded and unless he comes to term with his own wounds. So this great, anthemic passage out of Philippians, he gave up his godhood and came down to be a suffering servant for all of humanity. And there's our example. To each of us understand our own woundedness so that we can reach out as a healer to somebody else. In fact, that may be the meaning of our suffering in totality, is just to say, to acknowledge the woundedness and say, I can walk alongside of you. And Lois can walk alongside somebody different than I can, than you can, Dustin, or Louisa can, or whoever's here listening in. We all have our experiences that are relatable to somebody else in our own pain and our own suffering. Even myself as a therapist, I constantly remind myself, I am just a wounded healer here. I'm just somebody who's imperfect and struggling and suffering, and comes into relationship with somebody else who's the same. We're equal here. But
right.
in a strange kind of way in relationship, especially in Christ, we heal each other and we call out that healing from one another as we walk through, not under, not over, not around these disappointments and losses.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. Louisa.
Oh, well, I was still processing what Tim was saying, so you caught me off guard. Yeah. So, I talked a lot about, Laura talked about witnessing and being present. And if you've been around me for any period of time, you'll have heard me talk about this, and talked about Job and his friends, and the practice of sitting Shiva in the Jewish tradition and just being present with one another. But I'm just mentioning that I don't want to go into that. What I've been thinking about a lot about recently, and something that I didn't get for a long time, was, Jesus wept, right? When Lazarus died, and he knew he could raise him. He knew that was going to happen. But what I hear is Jesus was just really present with what he was feeling right then, right? That was really sad, and he was feeling empathy for the other people around him, and just the humanness of that, and being present with the feelings that he was feeling. And I don't know, that has really been shaping me as a person, and focusing on just my humanness. We have these gifts, right? Our emotions and our ability to be with one another and sensing one another, what's been going on. These are gifts, and just allowing that and allowing these emotions to be what they are, and to validate what the other person is experiencing and what I'm experiencing. And just speaks to that. I need to feel my feelings, and I need to allow them to be and to be witnessed. I'm not quite sure that I'm really answering the question, but that's something that I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that shapes me, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, an aspect that I hear in your answer, Louisa, is, for other people who might not choose to follow the Jesus way, there may be a resistance or a hesitancy to allowing that grief, the pain, the participation in some, because of one reason or another, but because Jesus is the one who participates in our pain and suffering, therefore we open ourselves up to it. We allow ourselves to feel the fullness of it, the depths of it. The Jesus cry on the cross, of God forsakenness, where are you? It gives us permission to be fully human, and we can't be fully human if we don't grieve, if we're not present to what we've lost. And it's to not open a gift that we've been given, as strange as that is, or counterintuitive as that is to say. Yeah. Lois, how about you?
I think what I do, particularly at work, and it is not just with my patients and in my clinical work, but it's also with my colleagues, is when I pray quietly to myself. I don't often pray with clients or with patients.
Sure.
Over the years, it's just not, I'm in the public school system and I don't pray publicly with them, but I often will bring somebody home with me in my head and in my heart, and I remember them through either the day or the week or the night. And my colleagues too, I pray for them. And they don't know it. It doesn't matter. I don't care if they know it or, well, I mean, it'd be nice if I could pray with them. That would be lovely.
Sure,
but
sure. Yeah.
I think
That's not necessarily the point, is what I'm hearing you say. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's really important that we lift people up. Not that God needs reminding, but I don't really understand how prayer works. That's a whole nother discussion, right? But,
yeah, we'll do another webinar on that and solve it later.
But I just feel it's important to do that, and if it's only for myself, but I also feel it's important for somebody else. And sometimes I get the opportunity to say something to somebody. If I get that chance, I will, but I don't often get that opportunity. So that's what I do at work. Outside of work with my family and friends, then I can be a little bit different.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the power and importance of prayer in opening us up to the experiences of others, of helping ourselves feel or imagine ourselves in other people's shoes. Like that can be a great tool that prayer is.
And
wonderful.
to ask God to bring people into their life to help them with whatever they're dealing with, because I have 10 minutes, right? I only have 10, 15 minutes with the person. And I can't be there for any length of time. Certainly not overnight as they cry and whatever, but I can ask God to bring somebody else to them. So beautiful. Maybe that's what prayer is. I don't know.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So we've got one question here, and it's from our friend Hannah, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it and then give us a chance to respond. So she says, I really like what you all said about making meaning in the midst of suffering. But I've also heard and seen too many people try to wrap up their experiences of suffering before having gone through it by talking about all the things that they have learned and gained from their suffering. I experienced this pressure myself, trying to wrap things up and demonstrate wisdom and meaning as I grieved. And so I wonder if any of you would have something to say about the balance between making meaning in the midst of suffering and trying to wrap it up before it's through. So anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say something. I don't think suffering's ever done. I think that it continues, and maybe not to the same degree. But I think that is an important part of life. I think that is necessary for it to not stop and to be done with.
Yeah,
that's
really helpful. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Louisa.
Oh, that's okay. I absolutely agree. Yes, suffering is a part of life, and it's the thing we can guarantee in life, right? We are all going to experience suffering and pain. And what I noticed about this question is, yeah, we love to make meaning of things, and we want to. It's like we're trying to jump too many steps ahead of ourselves, right? Because if I find the meaning, right, maybe that'll help with the pain right now and the emotions I'm feeling right now, right? And sometimes what it can do is it maybe minimizes what I'm feeling or minimizes what the other person is feeling, right? If we try to provide advice, solutions, right, making meaning or fixing. And I think it's part of just being present right there in the moment. And I know that in the future, I may be going to find meaning in this loss, but right now I'm just sad, or right now I'm just angry, right? And allowing ourselves just to feel the feelings. Yeah, and I think it's a balance. Like as Hannah was saying, it is a balance, and noticing, maybe asking ourselves, why am I trying to grab for that meaning, right? What am I hoping that grabbing for that meaning will do, and am I just avoiding what else is going on for me, what I'm feeling?
Yeah.
That's great. Now, I would just add one more thing, Hannah. I think it's a beautiful question. And probably one of my goals is to help people live inside of two opposite things that are happening in their life at the same time and be okay with that. Because this is really hard space, right? Where one day we can feel like we're okay with this and we found some meaning and we've resolved it. And the next day it's all chaos and hell again. And that's okay, right? So I just want to help validate people and say, that's all right. You don't have to be either one of those people. Neither of them are bad or good. That's both. We're both those things right now. And we can have, for instance, we can have fond memories of a person and we can be in deep grief and pain because we miss that person. Yet we might feel like we need to be through this one over here and all the way into this one over here. And I agree, Lois. It's not that we're moving towards one side or the other in permanence. It's that we are both these people in our human experience now. And that's one of the ways that I think I see people find peace, is to come to terms with that. I can be both. I can be both in pain and grateful at the same time and find meaning in it.
Yeah, I think another aspect is that as we continue through the process of grief and meaning making, the thing about meaning is meaning is multifaceted. It has layers and levels to it. And so you can understand what it means in a particular way at one point, but then something happens and you drop down another level deeper and you're like, oh, whoa, this is way bigger than I initially thought. And so, giving yourself permission to, while all of these things are true simultaneously and all of that too, to say the meaning you make of it now is the meaning that you have made of it now. And that may change or evolve too as your time goes on.
Yeah, we do this with scripture all the time, right? We read a verse 5 years ago, it meant one thing to me, but now it means something completely different. And we carry both of those. It's not that we were wrong 5 years ago. It's that we're in a different place right now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So one more question is from Jennifer Davis, and she asks, what are your thoughts on helping kids through all of this right now, especially when it's challenging enough to manage your own experience? How do you help a young person who, I often have to consult the feelings wheel. Do you all know the feelings wheel? It's like, what am I feeling? I have to look at this chart and I'm like, am I feeling that or that? So how do we help young people name what they're feeling, or help them navigate grief and loss and disappointment of not being able to see their friends and that sort of thing?
I love that. I love that you are a proponent of the feeling wheel and recognizing, yeah, like even sometimes I have to look at it and I think, oh no, I am feeling this very specific emotion. But having conversations with your kids and talking about like, what's this like for them and helping them name the emotion that they're feeling, right? Or multiple emotions. I can see that you're really frustrated and that you are feeling sad that you're missing your friends, or that you're disappointed that you can't, that you're not having a Christmas party at school, or maybe they're older kids and they aren't doing prom, and identifying the emotions, labeling it, validating it, or maybe, and if they're younger, is posing and wondering if you're feeling angry, or helping them develop that language around what's going on. Absolutely.
Yeah, the openness on that side is really helpful too. I'm wondering, rather than saying you're this, you're feeling this, saying I wonder if this is what you're experiencing right now, and helping them name it on their own.
Yeah.
I think another thing is just, I think maybe the least helpful thing that we can do is denying the grief or the loss or the pain. I think that's the least helpful thing to say. It's not really that bad. It could have been worse. Be grateful for what you do have. All those things can be true, but denial isn't our friend when it comes to helping our kids and young people through this.
Yeah, there's a really very popular teaching by Brene Brown on this right now, empathy versus sympathy, right? And empathy is, you'll be okay, it'll be all right. I mean, that's sympathy, you'll be okay, it'll be all right. Empathy is, wow, that sucks, and going down into the hole with somebody, right? And this is just terrible, what we're going through right now. So one of the things that we do when we stay at the level of sympathy is we often say things like, well, look on the bright side, or at least you can talk to your friends online. And we're always, well, just think what we're trying to do. We're trying to appease a child with the things that we want for ourselves. We want explanations, control. That's really not what we want. We want comfort, somebody to be in this with us. Here's the other thing I would really caution parents on right now is to not rely on their children for their own emotional needs. Children have really special emotional needs right now that they need their parents to fulfill as parents. But so many of us as parents are stressed. We're not turning to our pastor, our therapist, our friend for our emotional needs to be met. We're putting that back on our children. And I've seen this, and I have to talk with parents routinely about this. Ask yourself the question before you respond. Are you trying to get an emotional response out of your child that you need, or are you there to crawl into the hole with your child and meet their emotional needs right now? So that's one of the real keys, I think, that could help us as parents just think through our own reactions to our children too.
Yeah. I want to add to that. I absolutely agree with you, Tim. And thinking, I think it's really easy to minimize our kids' experiences, or, like even just my kiddo, oh, but it's going to take a little bit longer because we're going to order this thing online, and the postal service is taking a long time, right? And he gets upset about it. And recognizing that so David Kessler is a grief specialist, and he talks about the worst grief is the grief that you're experiencing right now, right? And so that's the loss that he has, right? Or the fact that you can't hang out with your kids, right? That's a huge loss, and not minimizing it and recognizing that whatever loss they're experiencing, that's a big loss, and to honor it, right? Like to acknowledge that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's good. All right, well, I'm just looking at the time here, and we are at our time. So thank you all, each of you, Lois and Tim and Louisa, for sharing so openly and honestly and beautifully to help us walk through this season and through this significant part of our lives. And thank you all for for watching along and tuning in with us. And if you know somebody who would be blessed by this, we'd love for you to share it with them. It'll be available on our Facebook and YouTube page. So as we close here, I want to close with a blessing from an Irish poet and priest and companion to those in grief and loss and disappointment, named John O'Donohue. And this is a blessing that he wrote called For Absence. It's a blessing for absence. And so I'll read this, and it'll be our prayer as we close. May you know that absence is alive with hidden presence, that nothing is ever lost or forgotten. May the absences in your life grow full of the eternal echo. May you sense around you the secret elsewhere, where the presences that have left you dwell. May you be generous in your embrace of loss. May the sore well of grief turn into a seamless flow of presence. May your compassion reach out to the ones we never hear from. May you have the courage to speak for the excluded ones. May you become the gracious and passionate subject of your own life. May you not disrespect your mystery through brittle words or false belonging. May you be embraced by the God in whom dawn and twilight are one. And may your longing inhabit its dreams with the great belonging. Amen. Go in grace and peace. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.